The night was electric, charged with a tension that could almost be felt in the air. Cleveland, Ohio, July 11, 1951. The city was just another Midwestern town, but tonight, something extraordinary was about to happen. It was a Thursday, and the clock ticked closer to midnight. The radio station WJW was abuzz with activity, and inside the studio, a young, brash disc jockey named Alan Freed was about to change the course of music history. Freed, with his signature hoarse voice and a love for the unconventional, was about to debut a new radio show. But this wasn't just any show. It was a bold move, a daring experiment that would introduce white America to a music genre that had been largely hidden from them rhythm and blues. The station's executives were nervous, but Freed was undeterred. He knew this was his moment, and he was going to make it count. As the clock struck midnight, Freed stepped up to the microphone. "Welcome everyone to the Moondog's house party," he bellowed, his voice dripping with enthusiasm and just a hint of the blues. "This is Alan Freed, and we're here to turn this city upside down with the hottest rhythm and blues you've ever heard." The first song hit the airwaves like a thunderbolt. It was raw, it was wild, and it was unlike anything Cleveland had ever heard before. The switchboard at WGW lit up instantly. Listeners called in, confused, excited, and more than a little shocked. Some were appalled, but many more were captivated. This was music that spoke to the soul, that made people move, that broke down barriers. Freed wasn't the first white disc jockey to play R&B. Guys like Hunter Hancock in Los Angeles, Dewey Phillips in Memphis, and Gene Nobles in Nashville had been spinning R&B records for years. But Freed was different. He had a presence, a charisma that made him stand out. He didn't just play the music, he became a part of it. He howled at the records, screamed along with the music, rattled a cowbell, and even banged out a beat on a telephone book with his fists. He was the perfect salesman for this new, unconventional sound. The show was an instant hit. At first, the audience was primarily black, but within months, young white listeners were tuning in nightly. They were drawn to the energy, the passion, and the raw emotion of the music. Freed's show was more than just a playlist. It was a cultural revolution. He called his listeners Moondoggers, and they embraced the name with pride. They were part of something bigger, something that was breaking down the walls of segregation and bringing people together through the power of music. Freed's success didn't go unnoticed. Leo Mintz, the owner of a local record store, saw the potential and became Freed's sponsor. Together, they began to organize live concerts, the first of which was the Moondog Coronation Ball on March 21, 1952. The event was a disaster and a triumph all at once. The Cleveland Arena, which could hold 10,000 people, was overwhelmed by a crowd that swelled to between 16,000 and 25,000. The police had to intervene and the concert was canceled, but the chaos only fueled the legend. Freed and his partners were thrust into the national spotlight, and the Moondog's appeal spread like wildfire. The Moondog's influence continued to grow. Freed's show was picked up by WMGR in Newark, New Jersey, bringing his wild approach to rhythm and blues to the New York area. The Moondog Kingdom expanded, and Freed's reputation as the king of the Moondoggers was solidified. But just when it seemed like nothing could stop him, a challenge emerged from the streets of New York. Louis Hardin, a blind street musician known for his Viking-like appearance and eccentric performances, had been using the name Moondog since the 1940s. He didn't take kindly to Freed's use of the name, and sued him in the New York State Supreme Court. The judge ruled in Hardin's favor, and Freed was forced to pay $5,700 in damages and stop using the Moondog name. It was a blow, but Freed was nothing if not resourceful. With the help of his friend Morris Levy, Freed and his team brainstormed a new name. The answer came to them in a bar, over a few drinks. Rock and roll, someone suggested, and the room erupted in agreement. Freed's show would now be called the Rock and Roll Party. It was a simple change, but it marked the beginning of a new era. The music, the culture, and the movement all came together under the banner of rock and roll. Freed wasted no time in embracing his new identity. He applied the term to his program, the music he played, and the concerts he organized. The first Rock and Roll Jubilee Ball was held at St. Nicholas Arena in New York City in January 1955, and the name caught on like wildfire. Rock and roll was no longer just a genre of music. It was a cultural phenomenon, a symbol of rebellion, and a force that was reshaping the nation. By the end of 1954, rock and roll had arrived. It was the soundtrack of a generation, the voice of a new youth culture, and the harbinger of a changing America. The music was raw, powerful, and unapologetic, and it was about to explode onto the national stage. In Chicago, Chuck Berry was signing with Chess Records. In Memphis, Elvis Presley was recording his first song. And in Hollywood, a movie was in production that would bring rock and roll to the silver screen. The world was about to change, and Alan Freed, the king of the rock and rollers, was at the center of it all. In the spring of 1955, a movie called Blackboard Jungle hit the screens, and it changed everything. Frank Zappa, who would later become a rock legend, remembered it vividly. When the movie's opening credits rolled, Bill Haley and his Comets blasted out "Rock Around the Clock." It was the loudest, most electrifying sound kids had ever heard in a movie theater. Zappa jumped up and down, feeling the power of the song. It was like a battle cry for teenagers, and it became the anthem of the rock and roll revolution. The movie came out at a time when most Americans were feeling pretty good about the future. In January, families gathered around their TV sets to watch President Eisenhower's press conference, feeling safe and secure with a war hero in the White House. The country was booming, and people were buying new homes in the suburbs, fancy cars, and the latest gadgets. Sports fans cheered for the Brooklyn Dodgers winning the World Series, and kids were obsessed with Davy Crockett, the king of the wild frontier, thanks to Disney. But while kids were into Davy Crockett, teenagers were all about rock and roll. Before Blackboard Jungle, rock and roll had already started to make its way onto the pop charts. But it was Rock Around the Clock that really brought the music to the masses. Bill Haley and his Comets had recorded the song in 1954, but it didn't take off until it became the theme for Blackboard Jungle. The song shot to #1 on the charts, and stayed there for 8 weeks. It stayed on the charts for over 6 months, and by the end of 1955, rock and roll was a household name. But not everyone saw rock and roll as something new. R&B artists like Dave Bartholomew, Ruth Brown, and Bo Diddley pointed out that they had been playing rhythm and blues for years. Bartholomew said, "We were playing rhythm and blues for a long time, and all of a sudden, because white people are doing it, it's being called rock and roll." But it was still just rhythm and blues. Ruth Brown agreed, adding, "At what point did rhythm and blues start becoming rock and roll? When the white kids started to dance to it." Bo Diddley was even more direct. Rhythm and blues became rock and roll when white boys began to play it. While they had a point, rock and roll by 1955 was more than just R&B. It was a mix of black R&B, white country and western, white pop, and other styles. The fact that this hybrid music was attracting both black and white audiences showed that things were changing in the music industry and American culture. By 1953, R&B records were selling more than ever, and about 20 to 30% of the listeners were white. This trend only grew in 1954 and 1955. One of the key figures in this change was disc jockey Alan Freed. In April 1954, Billboard magazine noted that about 1/3 of the audience at R&B concerts Freed hosted was white. Freed's Rock and Roll Jubilee Ball, in January 1955, had an audience that was 50 to 70% white. Freed himself admitted that this was when he first realized that white people enjoyed rhythm and blues. The rise of rock and roll wasn't just about the music. It was about a new generation finding its voice. The kids who heard Rock Around the Clock in Blackboard Jungle knew they were part of something big. They were part of a movement that would change the world. By 1955, the big beat was sweeping the nation, and it was all thanks to the merging of rhythm and blues R&B with pop music. Music trade writers noted that nearly 20% of the records being made with pop artists had an R&B beat, sound, or arrangement. The kids were clearly craving music with a strong beat, and the music industry was quick to catch on. Alan Freed, a radio DJ, was one of the key figures in this transformation. He started using the term rock and roll to describe this new sound, and his nightly radio show on Winds in New York City became a hit. Freed's influence was so significant that he was soon billed as America's #1 rock and roll disc jockey. Disc jockeys across the country followed Freed's lead. Jumpin' George. Oxford, a popular R&B DJ in San Francisco, began introducing his shows with phrases like, "Hi, old Jumpin' George here on case, and till 5 o'clock tryin' once again to rock you and roll you to satisfy your soul, you hear." He even introduced Chuck Berry's Maybelline as a hit under any name, whether you called it R&B or rock and roll. This blending of genres was evident in his concert promotions, where he billed R&B artists like the El Dorados and Laverne Baker as rock and roll stars. Television also played a crucial role in spreading the rock and roll craze. Bill Haley and his Comets made a big splash when they appeared on Milton Berle's show, performing Rock Around the Clock. Ed Sullivan, another influential TV host, decided to feature rock and roll on his variety show. He invited Dr. Jive Tommy Smalls, a local R&B DJ, to host a segment with R&B artists like Laverne Baker and Bo Diddley. However, Sullivan's staff tried to control the content, asking Bo Diddley to sing 16 Tons instead of his own hit, Bo Diddley. Bo, being the rebellious artist he was, stuck to his guns and performed his own song, much to the delight of the audience and the frustration of Sullivan's staff. Movies were another powerful medium for promoting rock and roll. Blackboard Jungle, released in March 1955, was a groundbreaking film that used Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley and his Comets in its opening and closing credits. The movie's portrayal of juvenile delinquency in an urban high school was intense and realistic, setting the tone for the rebellious youth culture of the time. The film's opening scene, with its loud and foreboding music, immediately grabbed the audience's attention. The soundtrack and the film's content worked together to create a sense of danger and rebellion, making Rock Around the Clock a hit and solidifying rock and roll's place in American culture. Teens were also finding role models in other films. The Wild One, starring Marlon Brando, had already set the stage for rebellious youth culture with its iconic line, "What are you rebelling against?" Rebel Without a Cause, released in 1955, further cemented this image with James Dean's portrayal of a troubled middle-class teenager. Dean's cool demeanor and pouty sneer became a fashion trend, and many young people saw themselves in his character, feeling like they were trapped in a meaningless adult world. The success of these films and the growing popularity of rock and roll music showed that a new youth culture was rising. The media, from radio to television to movies, played a crucial role in shaping this culture. By the mid-1950s, rock and roll was not just a fad. It was a powerful force that was changing the way young people thought, dressed, and lived. The movie Blackboard Jungle was a big deal in 1955. It showed a school where teachers struggled with tough, rebellious kids. The movie was a mix of drama and real fears about young people in America. The teachers in the film, like Mr. Dadier, had to deal with gangs of kids from different backgrounds: Black, Puerto Rican, Italian, Irish, and Jewish. The movie made it seem like violence could break out at any moment, and it did in one scary scene where a gang attacked 2 teachers in a back alley. Music played a big role in the movie. When the adults were around, you heard jazz. But when the kids took over, it was all about rock and roll. In one scene, a teacher named Richard Kiley tried to connect with the students by bringing in his jazz records. But the gang leader, Artie West, made fun of him and forced the teacher to play a valuable jazz record. The kids then trashed all the records, showing they wanted nothing to do with the adults' music. Despite the chaos, the movie had a happy ending. Mr. Dadier managed to win over most of his students, including a black student named Gregory Miller, who was played by Sidney Poitier. But it wasn't easy, and there was a big showdown with Artie West and his gang. In a very 1950s moment, a student used an American flag to stop a fight, which added a patriotic touch to the story. The movie wasn't just entertainment. It also had a lot to say about youth, race, violence, and public education. It even showed the power of rock and roll, which was new and exciting for many young people. But not everyone was happy. Many adults thought rock and roll was dangerous, and blamed it for causing trouble. They called it primitive, and said it was jungle music. Some even thought it was a communist plot to make America look bad. When the movie came out, it caused a stir. In movie theaters, kids started dancing in the aisles, and sometimes things got out of hand. There were reports of broken seats and even street riots. Some adults said the music in the movie, especially Rock Around the Clock, by Bill Haley and his Comets, was to blame. The song became a hit and young people loved it. They played it loud, and even used it to start their own rebellions. At Princeton University, students played the song so loud that they had to be stopped by a dean. Despite the mixed reactions, Rock Around the Clock became one of the biggest hits of 1955. It stayed at #1 for 8 weeks, and sold over 6 million copies. The song became a symbol of rock and roll and teenage rebellion. Even though older people didn't like it, young people embraced it as their own. The music industry saw the success of Rock Around the Clock and started promoting more rock and roll. Some record companies signed country singers who could appeal to young people. For example, Boyd Bennett and the Rockets, who were from Kentucky, had a big hit with 17. Other pop artists like Eddie Howard and the Cheers also found success with songs that spoke to teenagers. But the biggest trend was the cover record phenomenon. Major record companies realized they could make a lot of money by having white artists cover songs originally done by black artists. For example, the Maguire sisters covered Sincerely by the Moonglows and went to #1. Georgia Gibbs covered Etta James's The Wallflower and changed it to Dance With Me, Henry. Her version was much tamer and more pop-oriented, but it became a huge hit. These cover records often lacked the energy and authenticity of the original R&B songs, but they were more acceptable to mainstream audiences. This trend continued throughout 1955, as major record companies tried to cash in on the rock and roll craze. Even though it sometimes meant watering down the original music, the covers helped introduce R&B to a wider audience and made rock and roll a mainstream phenomenon. The year 1955 was a pivotal moment in the history of music, especially when it came to the relationship between R&B and pop. It was a time when many white artists began covering songs originally performed by black R&B artists, often with tremendous commercial success. These covers, however, were met with mixed reactions, ranging from adoration to outrage. Georgia Gibbs, a popular singer, was one of the first to cover R&B songs, but she wasn't alone. Veteran crooner Perry Como released a mellow version of Gene and Eunice's Kokomo, which became a hit. Pat Boone, a new face on the pop scene, found tremendous success with his versions of R&B songs like The Charms' Two Hearts, Fats Domino's Ain't That a Shame, and Little Richard's Tutti Frutti and Long Tall Sally. Even Gayle Storm, known for her role in the TV show My Little Margie, entered the music scene with a cover of Smiley Lewis's I Hear You Knockin', which reached #2 on the chart. Pat Boone's success with R&B covers was particularly notable. He started as a Bing Crosby-style crooner, but was convinced by Randy Wood, the founder of Dot Records, to try his hand at R&B. Boone's first R&B cover, Two Hearts, Two Kisses, was a hit, reaching #16 on the pop charts. His cover of Ain't That a Shame did even better, hitting #1. Despite his awkward delivery and the stark contrast between his style and the original R&B versions, Boone's covers resonated with many white teenagers. By the end of the decade, Boone would have more hit records on the rock charts than any artist except Elvis Presley. However, the success of these covers was not without controversy. Many R&B performers and their supporters felt that white artists were profiting at their expense. Laverne Baker, whose song Tweedledee was overshadowed by Georgia Gibbs's cover, was particularly outraged. She even asked her congressman to consider new copyright legislation to protect singers from what she called modern-day pirates. While her legal arguments didn't gain traction, her moral stance attracted significant support from fans, critics, and some music business executives. Alan Freed, a prominent disc jockey, was so opposed to white cover records that he refused to play them on his radio show, calling them anti-Negro. In August 1955, Wynn's Radio in New York City announced that it would no longer play cover records that merely duplicated the originals. The station's program director, Bob Smith, drew a distinction between traditional cover records, which were different-sounding versions of songs, and copy records, which allegedly duplicated the arrangements and styles of the original artists. However, this policy didn't apply to all covers, only those that were seen as direct copies. The issue of cover records was complex. While it was true that white artists were often more commercially successful with their versions, the practice of covering songs was nothing new. Music publishers had long encouraged multiple versions of a song to maximize royalties. For example, Hank Williams's Cold Cold Heart was a hit on the country and western charts, and pop versions by Tony Bennett and others also made the pop charts. R&B artists, too, covered songs by white artists. The Orioles, for instance, had a hit with a cover of Crying in the Chapel, originally a country and western ballad. The 1955 covers were unique, however, because they involved a new musical style and had a racial subtext. Major record companies were whitening black R&B to make it more palatable to mainstream, largely white, audiences. This coincided with the growing civil rights movement and the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown v. Board of Education, which ended segregation in public schools. The racial climate of the time made it easier for white artists to sell records to white audiences, who were more familiar with the polished, mainstream sound of pop music. Despite the racial dynamics, race wasn't the only factor. Many white listeners were simply more comfortable with the familiar sound of pop music. As Arnold Shaw, a music industry insider, explained, only a small percentage of young white listeners were ready for the raw and exuberant earthiness of rhythm and blues. White producers at major labels also had better resources for distribution, promotion, and advertising, giving their artists an edge over independent R&B labels. In the end, the 1955 cover records were a product of their time, reflecting both the musical and social tensions of the era. While they helped popularize R&B and introduced many original songs to a wider audience, they also raised important questions about race, creativity, and the music industry's practices. The mid-1950s were a time of significant change in the music industry, and one of the most notable trends was the rise of cover records. These were white artists' versions of R&B songs, which often overshadowed the original recordings. There were several reasons why these covers became so popular, and understanding them helps us see the complex dynamics of the era. One key factor was the technology of the time. In the mid-1950s, 45 RPM records were becoming the new standard, replacing the older 78 RPM record. These 45s were smaller, cheaper, and easier to produce, making them more accessible to a broader audience. White audiences, who generally had more disposable income, were quicker to adopt this new technology. Many R&B artists, on the other hand, were still releasing their music on 78s. This meant that when a song became popular, record companies could predict which ones would appeal to white listeners by seeing which R&B songs were being pressed on 45s. This technological divide helped steer white audiences away from many R&B artists. Another reason for the success of cover records was cultural. The 1950s were a time of strict social norms and conformity. Television and movies were closely monitored to ensure they didn't show anything considered offensive or vulgar. Similarly, the music industry was careful about what it promoted to mainstream audiences. Many R&B songs were seen as too raw or suggestive for the general public. White artists like Pat Boone often cleaned up the lyrics of these songs, making them more palatable. For instance, Boone changed the lyrics of Fats Domino's "Ain't That a Shame" to "Isn't That a Shame," and avoided songs with explicit content. This made the music more acceptable to a wider audience. The image of the artists also played a role. Pat Boone, for example, was marketed as an all-American boy, patriotic, religious, and family-oriented. His clean-cut image and preppy style made him a safe choice for parents and radio stations. This contrasted with the often more rebellious and earthy image of R&B artists. Boone and other cover artists helped make R&B music seem more respectable and less threatening to the mainstream. Despite the commercial success of cover records, they were not without controversy. Many critics, especially in later years, have condemned these records as racist imitations that stole the work of black artists. However, the truth is more nuanced. Cover records did play a role in popularizing early rock and roll. They acted as a bridge, introducing white audiences to a new sound they might not have otherwise heard. Pat Boone has said that in the mid-1950s, America wasn't ready for the raw energy of R&B. His versions, while less authentic, helped make the music more accessible. Once audiences became familiar with the sound through cover records, they were more open to the original R&B artists. The success of cover records also had economic implications. Major record companies and their artists made a lot of money, but the small, independent labels that produced the original R&B records also benefited. These labels often owned the publishing rights to the songs, so they earned royalties from both the originals and the covers. This meant that songwriters and publishers received additional income from the popularity of cover version. However, the original R&B artists often suffered the most. They lost potential record sales and fame when cover versions overshadowed their work. Stories like that of Smiley Lewis, whose career was reportedly damaged by a cover of I Hear You Knockin', highlight the negative impact on these artists. Despite these challenges, some R&B artists did manage to cross over onto the pop charts. Mercury Records, for example, was one of the first to use the term rock and roll to market R&B records to a broader audience. Artists like Fats Domino, Chuck Berry, and the Platters began to achieve consistent success on the pop charts. Fats Domino, in particular, became a major star thanks to his unique New Orleans sound. This sound, which blended R&B, boogie-woogie, jazz, and other genres, was a significant influence on early rock and roll. Dave Bartholomew, a talented producer and musician, played a crucial role in shaping this sound and producing many of Domino's hits. In the end, the cover record phenomenon was a complex and multifaceted part of music history. While it had its drawbacks, it also played a role in broadening the audience for R&B and paving the way for the rise of rock and roll. The original R&B artists, although often overlooked at the time, are now recognized for their contributions to this groundbreaking era in music. Dave Bartholomew stood in the tiny J&M studio, his eyes scanning the room. The place was no bigger than an ordinary motel room, but it was packed with the sounds that would shape the future of music. Cosimo Matassa, the Italian-American owner of J&M, had turned the backroom of his music and appliance store into a recording studio. Bartholomew knew that this small space, located on Rampart Street and overlooking Congo Square, was where the New Orleans sound was being born. "It's true," Dave said, reflecting on the unique blend of music and culture that defined New Orleans. "We have a New Orleans sound. If you have a birthday, we'll throw a party for you, and we'll have somebody do what's called a second line. It's like a parade, and people just join in, dancing and singing. We just love to party." Fats Domino, a local piano player with a big smile and a smooth voice, was one of the key figures in this sound. His music, with its call and response pattern and distinct rhythms, captured the essence of New Orleans. The call and response was like a conversation between Fats and his band, with Fats leading and the band echoing back. The audience, like the second line participants, joined in with their own dancing and singing. In 1949, Fats was playing at the Hideaway Club when Dave Bartholomew and Lou Chudd, the owner of Imperial Records, walked in. The room was filled with smoke and the sound of Fats's piano. The crowd was wild, and when Fats played his signature song, The Junkers Blues, the place erupted. Chudd saw potential and offered Fats a deal on the spot. A few days later, Fats and Dave were in the J&M studio, working hard to get the right sound. The studio was small, and the equipment was basic, but they were determined. They changed the lyrics of The Junkers Blues and retitled it The Fat Man. Fats played a rolling, boogie-woogie piano intro and launched into an infectious vocal, even imitating a mouth harp with his wah-wah-wah-wah falsetto. The record was a hit, and Fats Domino became a star. Fats and Dave continued to produce a string of hits, including Goin' Home, which reached #1 on the R&B charts, but the New Orleans sound wasn't just about Fats. It was also embodied in the music of other artists like Lloyd Price, who had a hit with Lottie Miss Claudie, and Smiley Lewis, who recorded I Hear You Knockin'. These songs, produced by Dave Bartholomew and his band, featured the same big, infectious sound that was becoming synonymous with New Orleans. By the mid-1950s, the New Orleans sound was reaching a wider audience. Fats Domino's Ain't That a Shame was covered by Pat Boone, a white pop singer, and although Boone's version became a #1 hit, Fats's original still made it into the top 10. This introduced Fats to a new, larger audience, including white teenagers and their parents. Dave and Fats saw an opportunity to make their music appeal to everyone. They started writing songs that could be enjoyed by both the R&B crowd and the growing white teenage market. "We wanted to have everybody enjoy our music," Dave explained. "We love rhythm and blues, but we also wanted to play rock and roll that everyone could understand." While Fats was making waves in New Orleans, another musician was making his mark in St. Louis. Chuck Berry, a guitarist and singer, was influenced by a mix of blues, R&B, country, and pop. He grew up listening to a variety of music on the radio, and learned to play guitar by listening to his favorite artists. By the early 1950s, Chuck was performing in local bars with a trio that included drummer Ebby Harding and pianist Johnny Johnson. They played a mix of genres to cater to the diverse crowds, including both blacks and whites. One night, Chuck met his idol Muddy Waters at a blues bar in Chicago. Muddy gave him advice, telling him to see Leonard Chess at Chess Records. Chuck took the advice and soon found himself in the studio, recording songs like Wee Wee Hours, 30 Days, You Can't Catch Me, and Eider Red. Leonard Chess was particularly impressed by Eider Red, a country-influenced song that Chuck had written. Chess arranged for a recording session, and Chuck's career took off. As Fats Domino and Chuck Berry were making their mark, the New Orleans sound was evolving into what would become known as rock and roll. The big, infectious beat, the call and response patterns, and the mix of genres were all part of the sound that would change the music world. Fats and Chuck, along with other artists like Little Richard and Elvis Presley, were the pioneers of this new genre, and their music continues to inspire generations of musicians today. As the 1950s rolled on, the world of music was changing in ways no one could have predicted. In the summer of 1955, Chuck Berry and his band stepped into a recording studio with Willie Dixon on bass. They were about to create something special. Berry remembers, "The first song we recorded was Ida May." But Leonard Chess, the record producer, had different ideas. He thought the name sounded too country, so he looked around the studio and spotted a mascara package. He suggested changing the name to Maybelline, with a slight tweak to avoid any legal trouble. After 36 takes, the song was finally perfect. Leonard Chess was convinced Maybelline could be a hit, so he took a copy to New York and handed it to Alan Freed, a famous radio DJ. To increase the song's chances, Chess added Freed's name to the list of co-writers. When Maybelline was released, it quickly caught everyone's attention. Music magazines praised it, and it shot up the charts, reaching number 5 on the pop charts. The song's blend of rhythm and blues, country, and pop, along with its catchy story about cars and romance, made it a favorite among teenagers. While Chuck Berry was making waves with Maybelline, other artists were also crossing over from rhythm and blues to the mainstream pop charts. The Platters, a smooth vocal group from Los Angeles, found success with their romantic ballads. Their hit, Only You, reached number 5 on the pop charts. They became known for their harmonies and slower, romantic songs, which were perfect for slow dancing. Other African-American artists, like Chuck Miller, Johnny Ace, and the Five Keys, also made their mark on the pop charts. Their songs, like House of Blue Lights and Pledging My Love, showed that rock and roll was becoming a melting pot of different styles and influences. The Penguins, an R&B group from Los Angeles, had a big hit with Earth Angel. This doo-wop ballad climbed to number 8 on the pop charts and became a classic. It inspired many other vocal groups to form and set the standard for the doo-wop sound that would dominate the late 1950s. However, not all R&B artists found it easy to cross over. Bo Diddley, despite his success on the R&B charts, struggled to break into the pop market. His style was too unique, and white audiences weren't quite ready for it yet. Other R&B artists tried to capitalize on the rock and roll craze, but with mixed results. By the end of 1955, rock and roll had become a significant part of American culture. It had a name, it was everywhere in the media, and it had stars like Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, and Bill Haley. But something was still missing: a star who could truly embody what rock and roll was all about. The music needed someone who could connect with both black and white audiences, someone who could bridge the gap and bring everyone together. That person would soon arrive. A young, charismatic white boy from the South would step forward and change everything. He would become the king of rock and roll, and help shape the sound and spirit of a generation. The stage was set, and the world was ready for Elvis Presley,